Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is Jing, Cultivating Stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot's lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. It's any meeting between Taoists because it's always about the Tao in some respect. Remembering the sacred, maintaining sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes both a formal talk and more open discussion. For this second set of talks, I want to discuss some more technical topics, especially relevant for members of the Daoist Foundation and for the larger global Daoist community, whether from an adherent or scholarly perspective. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So for this Lundao, I want to focus on being Daoist, Daoist being, with specific attention to questions about Daoist identity, location, and participation. At times, I will speak from a normative, lived Daoist perspective. So one who speaks does not know, one who knows does not speak. And because they could not be recognized, we feel compelled to describe their qualities. So these are allusions to the Tao Te Ching, chapter 56 and 15 respectively. And there's a paradox, right? So this is oftentimes invoked by people to kind of say, if somebody's speaking about the Tao, then you can't trust them. Or if someone knows about the Tao, they won't speak. But then we have this question about the Tao Te Ching itself. The Tao Te Ching was written, the Tao Te Ching is speaking. So is that untrustworthy? So what this is really about is how to speak as a Taoist. It's a contemplative inquiry about communication and appropriate expression. From a Taoist perspective, we can say that emphasis is on kind of essential and refined speech. I tend to think about this as what I refer to as soteriological linguistics. So soteriology is just a fancy way of saying discourse on actualization, liberation, perfection, realization, salvation, and so forth. So what's ultimately real? How do we kind of talk about the ultimate purpose of human existence? So when we look at this, the soteriological linguistics is how do we use speech to communicate something about that which is ultimate, that which is sacred, and directing us to some kind of practice realization. So this is beyond knowing, and it's talismanic. One of the emphases that you see in the Tao Te Ching and classical Taoism in the larger tradition is this sense of a kind of talismanic connection. So forming a connection with the Tao as mystery and then allowing that to infuse our communications. One of the reasons I want to talk about Taoist being in particular and move away from being Taoist is because various people are talking about Taoist identity in the modern world, but most often without authentic Taoist practice realization and usually without formal standing in the Taoist tradition. And this includes in the context of tradition-based Western Taoism. So one of the things that we find is this kind of emphasis or this tendency to privilege identity, but not fully understand the various forms of Taoist identity and participation from a Taoist perspective, especially informed by the tradition and the historical kind of contours of Taoism. So the first thing, the place to begin, as I mentioned at the opening of this talk, is the Tao. The Tao as the sacred and ultimate concern of Taoists. So the Tao is the sacred orientation of Taoists. It's this sacred orientation as primary. When we look at the Chinese character, the left side, the radical, is chuo, to walk or to move, and the right side is shou, head, so a human head. So humans walking on a path. So this is why Tao can also mean way with a small w, or the path to the Tao as way with an uppercase W. So thinking about the Tao this way means Taoism is the way to the way, but Taoism is ultimately about this kind of path that's trying to direct us towards something that's sacred, so towards something that's ultimately real. So in the Taoist tradition, you also have this tendency to use Tao in the sense of movements as ways. So we can think of something like Qian Shi Dao, the way of the celestial masters, or Chen Zhen Dao, the way of complete perfection, the two dominant movements or expressions of institutional Taoism in the modern world. So thinking about some preliminary points related to Taoist being. Taoism is an indigenous Chinese religion deeply rooted in traditional Chinese culture. There's this connection to Han ethno-cultural identity, so sometimes we refer to this more technically as Sinocentrism, that is kind of China as the center, and also Chinese and specifically Han ethno-cultural identity as one of the defining characteristics of Taoism. But there's a complex relationship among culture, ethnicity, and religion, and especially in a modern context. So where are we located? What kinds of backgrounds do we have? How are we located in relationship to Taoism as a Chinese source tradition? Are we of Han ethno-cultural identity, and so on? There's also this language dimension. So in the parentheses, there's Jing, scripture or classic, and one in the sense of culture and language, literary expression, and also Li, so ritual. So where you find the language connection in Taoism especially strong is the fact that all of the scriptures have been written in classical Chinese. Right? So do you need to know Chinese in order to be a Taoist, or at least to be able to kind of do scripture study? And then also in ritual, so the ability to kind of chant certain texts in Chinese, to be able to write using calligraphy, to kind of have petitions in Taoist ritual, and so on. So there's a very strong language connection in certain parts of the Taoist tradition, certain expressions of Taoist practice. So as an aside, we should also say there's this kind of question about religion. What is religion? And there's a lot of misconceptions about the idea of religion, religions, and religious, which I won't kind of belabor here. But one of the reasons we think about Taoism as a Chinese religion and a larger kind of global religion is because there's a strong emphasis on soteriology, which I mentioned before. So a sense of ultimate purpose in human existence, and also theology, so a sacred or ultimate concern. So of course, this centers on the Tao, as I mentioned before. So thinking about our lives in relationship to the Tao as sacred, that's a Taoist theological view, including certain ideas about what that theology is, or how the sacred can be understood. And then what we're trying to do as human beings, so ultimately to realize the Tao and at least orient ourselves towards the Tao. CF is just an abbreviation that means compare. So compare secularized Protestants that want to talk about Taoism as philosophy and fantasy. And the reason we say here secularized Protestants is that there's a kind of lack of awareness about why Taoism is being constructed in a particular way, right? That is that somehow you have access to Taoism or Taoist texts just on a personal level without any sense of connection to the tradition or a Taoist community. But Taoism is now a global religion characterized both by multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, multinationalism, and even multilingualism. So the last part is a little complicated because you have this question about Chinese still being the primary language of Taoism, especially historically speaking and in terms of the tradition. But we obviously are speaking many different languages in the modern world. There are Taoists in different countries speaking different languages and not even necessarily knowing Chinese. But global Taoism is rooted in Chinese Taoism as source tradition. So this is really important. Okay, so thinking about oneself as a Taoist also means a kind of recognition of Chinese Taoism as a source tradition. But from my perspective, Chinese Taoism is part of global Taoism. So there's a shift happening now where it's not that Western Taoism is inside of Chinese Taoism, right? Or however you want to think about that. That really Chinese Taoism is part of global Taoism. It might have a privileged position, but it's not the kind of overarching tradition. Global Taoism is the overarching tradition. So Chinese Taoism is part of that. So that would be a controversial view. There's a complex relationship among cultural ethnicity and religion, which I already mentioned, but thinking about one's own location, right? The background, my culture, my various ethnicities, what religion I was born into, if I do have one, and then so on. So we can compare this to Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, which are the dominant missionary religions. That there's a much stronger tendency of not just conversion to those traditions, but also evangelical or proselytizing activity in those traditions. So Taoists tend not to be that interested in conversion. This is changing a bit in the modern world, and there are political reasons for that. But in general, Taoists tend to just say, if you are interested in Taoism, if you have an affinity with Taoism, then there's a kind of space for you in the tradition. But there's a lack of concern whether someone's a Taoist or not in terms of being a Taoist, right? That is, my being a Taoist is independent of wanting other people to be Taoists or needing other people to be Taoists. So we can also think about this question of globalization in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, or whatever kind of combination you prefer or sequencing you prefer. I always put equity here first because yes, it's about diversity and inclusion, but it's also about who is given what kinds of opportunities and why. And so in this context, we're also thinking about the possibility of a Taoism that's inclusive, diverse, equitable, and that's not specifically privileging Chinese Taoism or Han Chinese Taoists. Okay, so that again is somewhat controversial and open, but there's this Sinification question. So that is being Chinese, including language. Do you have to be kind of ethnically Han to be Taoists? Okay, to be Taoists, I should say. Do you need to know Chinese? How much do you need to really understand traditional Chinese culture, right? In some ways we need to become Chinese to be Taoist? And again, this is complex, right? How we negotiate that question. But there is a very strong connection in Taoism, at least tradition-based Taoism, with traditional Chinese aesthetics, with traditional Chinese culture, with traditional Chinese cosmology, with classical Chinese, and so on. So we can think about this in terms of an import-export religion. Taoism is largely being imported outside of China. It's not being exported, right? It's not necessarily like Chinese Taoists are trying to globalize Taoism in the way that we think. It's more, there's a larger kind of global interest in Taoism. So importing Taoism, and then the question of who is representing Taoism in the modern world. So another kind of preliminary point that I would make is thinking about kind of key Taoist commitments and values and emphases. So Nei Jing Wai Jing, inwardly still and outwardly reverent. This is an allusion to the Neye, inward training chapter of the Guanzi, the Book of Master Guan. And this text tells us if we want to or we can return to our innate nature, Xing, then this is done through inward stillness and outward reverence. And so we can also think about that in the reverse, that innate nature is expressed inwardly as stillness and manifests outwardly as reverence. So there's a lot of emphasis in the modern world in terms of tradition-based Taoism on cultivating stillness, but you also have here this emphasis on reverence, reverence for the Tao, reverence for the world as the Tao, maybe also reverence for the body as the Tao. So thinking about some of these kinds of key Taoist principles and commitments, values, so we can have this contemplative inquiry about Taoist being. How do we think about identity? Where do we locate authority? Do we think this is related to a larger community? How are we involved in this? How are we positioned in relationship to it? So there are a lot of Taoist names for the Taoist tradition. Some of these might be less familiar to you. Some tend to be emphasized more than others with particular constructions. So Dao Jia, the family of the Tao, and Dao Jiao, the teachings of the Tao, sometimes in the modern world are talked about as so-called philosophical and so-called religious Taoism. These are fictions. The terms don't say this at all. That's not what they meant in context. This is a modern construction of Taoism. So what you notice here is that in the second and the third, Dao Jia and Dao Jiao, both are talking about the Tao, the sacred, or the ultimate concern of Taoists. One's emphasizing more of a way of understanding it in terms of a family, so a line of descent, a kind of specific kind of spiritual genealogy or ancestry. The second one is emphasizing more of teachings, and sometimes Jiao can be used in a more technical sense as doctrine. But in the Taoist tradition, this also assumes teachers. So who are the teachers of the Tao? Where do the teachings come from? Going back to the first one of my favorite terms that I think is really a classical Taoist designation for the Taoist tradition is Bu Yan Zhi Zhao, the teaching beyond or without words. So what does it mean if a tradition says, right, it is a teaching beyond or without words? It seems to undermine the very idea of a tradition or the emphasis on the Tao. But from a Taoist perspective, what this is really saying is we're more interested in the Tao as mystery, as a numinous presence, as something beyond words or beyond conceptualization, maybe beyond comprehension. So how do we speak the unspeakable? And that goes back to what I started with. One who speaks does not know. So if one knows, if one has gnosis, if one has a deep understanding and connection with the Tao, how do we express that in words? And this is saying, don't mistake the words for the reality. So we can think about the Zhuangs that says names are the guest of reality. So don't get lost in the kind of linguistic designation for it. Have the actual energetic experience. And this is why you have such a strong emphasis in Taoism on listening. Another really interesting name becomes especially important in Quanzhen, in complete perfection Taoism, in this kind of late medieval Taoist movement, is Wu Wei Qingjing Dao, the way of non-action and clear stillness. So this is really interesting because it connects to classical Taoism, especially the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, thinking about Taoism as the path that emphasizes Wu Wei, non-action or effortlessness, and clarity and stillness. So those would be two sets of Taoist values or Taoist commitments: effortlessness and clarity and stillness, and understanding Qingjing as going together, especially designating kind of quietistic meditation practice. Also, Xuanfeng, mysterious current. This literally means mysterious or dark wind, sometimes also translated as mysterious movement. Xuan, mysterious or dark, is an allusion to chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching again. So this Xuan character is invoking the Tao. We can almost think of it as synonymous with the Tao, as mystery with an uppercase M. So Taoism is the mysterious current. It's an energetic presence in the world. This is so much the case that Taoists sometimes speak of Tao Qi, the Qi of the Tao, or Wei energy, this kind of sacred presence, this numinous presence pervading everything. So it's very interesting to think about Taoism this way, is it's like a movement or a current flowing through everything that we can connect with, that can flow through us. Also, Xuanmen, the mysterious gate. So we were just talking about Xuan, darkness or mystery, but this particularly is an allusion again to chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, where it talks about the twofold mystery of the Tao, mysterious and again more mysterious, the gateway to all wonders. So Taoism becomes the Xuanmen, the mysterious gate, the portal into the Tao as mystery. So these are helpful for thinking about how we're located in the Taoist tradition, or how Taoists have tended to construct or understand the Taoist tradition. So one thing that you find a lot with people who are interested in Taoism or even think of themselves as Taoists is this question of belonging, right? Do I belong in this tradition? Sometimes I feel like I'm an insider, sometimes I feel like an outsider. Do I actually belong? And one way I like to think about this is breaking down belonging in the sense of participating in something or being accepted in something as belonging. We are longing for something larger. So is this the place where we feel at home? Is this the place where we feel a connection? And so it's interesting when we talk about this from a larger perspective, especially something like humanistic or transpersonal psychology. I'm thinking specifically of Abraham Maslow. And Maslow talked about a hierarchy of needs, moving from the most basic, so physiological, to safety, moving into the psychological, into belonging and love, into esteem, and then finally into self-fulfillment and actualization. So for Maslow, and it's debatable, whether or not this map is actually accurate. Do we need to belong in order to have fulfillment? Possibly. But in Maslow's construction, it's kind of hierarchical, meaning like you're moving from basic to more advanced, or this kind of larger emphasis on self-fulfillment. So we need some kind of material support to do Taoist practice, right? And then we also need some kind of psychological well-being, and a lot of times that relates to or involves kind of fulfilling and supporting relationships, a sense of community. But do we actually need to belong, or is belonging an obstacle to fully committing ourselves to something, or overcoming that sense of whether or not somebody else accepts us or recognizes us? So there's also a way to think about this from a Taoist aesthetic perspective, emphasizing detachment or renunciation, which is we may or may not belong, we may or may not be recognized, we may or may not be received, but we can still do our cultivation. There's something beyond that, beyond just being part of a community. So community is important, but self-cultivation and that kind of resiliency and that commitment. So what happens if we're nonconformists? What happens if we don't accept certain kinds of constructions? More than likely, we will be rejected. If we refuse to accept what cannot be accepted, what happens? If we follow the path of virtue in the midst of a lack of virtue, there's a likelihood that we won't belong, that we won't be accepted, we'll actually be rejected. So this is very complicated of thinking about the question of how attached are we to having this sense of belonging, and will that lead us astray? Will that disorient us? So the most important thing is cultivating sacred connection beyond social acceptance and responsibility or respectability. That is, if we follow a Taoist path, we may be at odds with the dominant culture. We may be at odds with what we can think about as consensus mind or consensus reality. And maybe this is what immortality really is in Taoism. So this is a montage of global Taoism. One of the things I'm trying to communicate here is Taoism as place-specific community infused with Taoist culture, with a Taoist aesthetics. It's not a complete representation, so we can say what is really included, what's not being included. Is there a larger frame beyond this? So one of the reasons to show you this and kind of represent it this way is we have a Taoist priest performing a ritual in liturgical garments and vestments right in the middle. Thinking about that in relationship to art, in the upper left-hand corner, and in the lower right-hand corner, a map of Chongyang of Redoubled Yang, the Palace of Redoubled Yang. This is the Taoist name of Wang Zhe, the founder of Quanzhen Complete Perfection. So this is actually a photograph of a mural map that's there that I took on site. But thinking about these kinds of maps and what they're representing and the places related to Taoism. On the lower left-hand corner is Yosemite. So I think about this a lot. Are there places that approximate the experience of Taoist place? So for me, Yosemite in Northern California really connects to Huashan, Mount Hua in Shanxi province, the central part of China. And thinking about like the aesthetics of it or the place-specific landscape of it. So in this case, granite rocks and so on. The upper right-hand corner is one of my favorite photographs. It's a photograph of the British Taoist Association. And one of the reasons I like it is it kind of shows the diversity of global Taoism, but the way in which there's this dialogue happening, this collaboration happening. And of course, many people are not represented in this photograph, but we can at least think of it as an approximation of this diversity of global Taoism. And also then thinking about the places that Taoists occupy, and does it have a uniquely Taoist aesthetic? So this is one of the things that I think is missing in the larger global Taoist community is, yes, there are place-specific communities, but does it have that Taoist culture? Does it have that Taoist aesthetic? So this is one of the things that we're working on. So thinking about being Taoist, so remember I said the primary emphasis in this talk is Taoist being. But there's a lot of discussion about being Taoist, and there's a history to this in Western discourse. So the teachings of Taoist Master Zhuang, which may or may not be a book you're familiar with, but was quite influential, was first published in 1978, and there was a later edition in 2000. So the picture on the left is the original edition by Michael Sassow, who was born in 1930, a Taoist scholar practitioner. He's actually an ordained Zhengyi Taoist priest. And so he talks a lot in his books, not just the teachings of Taoist Master Zhuang, but his larger kind of earlier books on modern Taiwanese Zhengyi or Orthodox Zhengyi Taoism, as talking about Orthodox Taoism versus heterodox Taoism. And so this starts to define Taoism in a pretty narrow way, specifically through the Zhengyi, the Orthodox Unity movement, and especially as it's being presented in modern Taiwan. And so, of course, we're talking about the late 60s and into the 70s and into the 80s in terms of that particular presentation. But this becomes very influential on other presentations of Taoism in the modern world. And again, you may or may not be familiar with these people, but Liu Ming, originally named Charles Bellier, he lived from 1947 to 2015. He had an organization called Orthodox Taoism in America, including this Frost Bell, which was the newsletter of Orthodox Taoism in America. And so he adopted this presentation of Sassow. He was developing that on his own, but thinking about something called Orthodox Taoism. And you also find this in the Taoist manual by Brock Silvers. So this is a very particular construction of being Taoist, right? It largely centers on ordination and even hierarchical ordination, being located in Chinese Taoism in a particular way, being trained in ritual, and so on. And so a kind of construction of Taoist identity in this more kind of conservative way, but also specifically, and this is what a lot of people don't recognize, through the Tianshi, through the Celestial Masters movement that becomes referred to as Zhengyi Orthodox Unity, which is a householder sub-tradition, emphasizing ritual primarily, and this kind of involvement of the community and the support of the community. So that leads to a very particular way of being a Taoist, or emphasizing how one is a Taoist. And even though a lot of these materials have started to fade out, I think, in a kind of more contemporary Taoist engagement or expression of global Taoism, they're highly influential, whether people know it or not. So whether the people presenting Taoism the way they are now, especially Taoist identity, are aware of it or explicitly referencing it, it fed into various message boards and chat rooms and even social media. And this is a very particular construction. So there are a lot of mistaken views about being Taoist. Okay, and here I'm talking more from a normative perspective. So what I think as a Taoist scholar practitioner. So some popular mistaken views is believing in the Tao makes one a Taoist. We would say this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for being Taoist. Taoism is what everyone says it is. So you have all these kinds of things like reading certain kind of popular versions of the Tao Te Ching and then saying I'm following these Taoist teachings. And it's like, is that really have any connection to Taoism as such? But really, whatever I want it to be, it is. So of course, this is a mistaken view. But also tradition-based Taoist views. So some of these are viable, right? Some Taoists actually believe this and teach this, that one must be Han Chinese to be a Taoist, that one must know Chinese language to be a Taoist, that one must be part of a movement or lineage to be a Taoist, that one must be initiated or ordained to be a Taoist. So even though this is part of Taoist identity, even though we can say some Taoists have these characteristics, some Taoists kind of construct Taoist identity this way, this is not necessarily the case, right? Not all Taoists are Han Chinese. Not all Taoists even have that kind of connection to traditional Chinese culture. not all Taoists know Chinese language. So as I mentioned, knowing Chinese is helpful for many things, right? It's important for scripture study. It's important for understanding Taoist technical terminology. It's important for doing ritual. It's even important for being able to communicate with modern and contemporary Chinese Taoists. But one doesn't have to know Chinese to be a Taoist. There are ways of kind of approximating it. There are ways of working around maybe that lack of facility with Chinese language. Also, not all Taoists throughout history or even in a modern context are part of a movement or lineage. There's a reason that people are constructing Taoist identity through lineage, right? And a lot of it is political, some of it's financial motivations and so on, or that one must be initiated or ordained to be a Taoist. The vast majority of Taoists throughout Taoist history have not been initiated or ordained. And here I'll just say that any form of discrimination is fundamentally un-Taoist. So if we're saying you're not a Taoist because you're not this, there's a kind of element of discrimination that I would say kind of contradicts fundamental Taoist values and commitments. So one thing you find in the modern world is these Taoist associations. So in Chinese, it's xiehui. I think it might be better to translate this as societies and make a distinction that I'm going to make in a moment. But xiehui is technically a political designation. It's part of the People's Republic of China. It's connected to the Bureau of Religious Affairs. So if you title something xiehui, like the Zhongguo Daojiao Xiehui, the Chinese Taoist Association, that is talking about this larger organization that's overseeing mainland Chinese Taoism. But it's as much of a political designation as a religious designation. So it's odd outside of China that people are using xiehui in their names. Part of that, of course, is legitimate in saying we are connected to, we have some kind of association with the Chinese Taoist Association. But you have these xiehuis in other countries, right? So you have the Faguo Daojiao Xiehui, the French Taoist Association, the Idali Daojiao Xiehui, the Italian Taoist Association. And that's fine. One of the ways of doing that is to position oneself or one's organization in relationship to mainland China. But there's this deeper question about the politics of it. So not just the politics of it in relationship to global Taoism or mainland Chinese Taoism, but the politics of it in terms of employing that term. Do you really want to align yourself with the People's Republic of China, and specifically the Communist Party? And the way in which Taoism is being constructed through the kind of pressure or the force of the Chinese Taoist Association through the Chinese Communist Party. So this is highly problematic, it's controversial. Saying these kinds of things will immediately locate me politically in relation to other things. But one of the reasons I'm saying this is because this is as much a limitation as a possibility, right? That is a very particular kind of institutional construction of Taoism that may or may not be aligned with larger Taoist values and commitments. So to this, we could compare it to something like Dao Hui, right? Actual Taoist associations. Hui literally means gathering or meeting. So a gathering or a meeting of the Tao, right? So not Daojiao Xiehui, not Taoism societies, but Dao Hui, a gathering or a meeting of the Tao. And this comes from early Quanzhen or complete perfection Taoism. The other thing that we find in a modern context is people talking about having multiple lineages or having temple affiliation. So this is usually through a kind of model based on Chan or Zen Buddhism. And this really involves multiple confusions, okay? You aren't Quanzhen and Zhengyi in Taoism. If you find this in the modern world, this is much of a confusion as it is a political act, because these movements or these sub-traditions have different charisms, right? So if you're Zhengyi, you're following a fundamentally different path than if you're Quanzhen and so on. So there's reasons for this, right? That part of it is when you see inside of Chan or Zen Buddhism, all of this discussion about multiple lineages and ancestry, it supposedly generates more political power. But one of the reasons that I say that there's some confusion here is that so those are movements, right? Zhengyi, Orthodox Unity, Quanzhen, Complete Perfection are movements. And then you have lineages. So you have family lineages. You also have more formal kind of institutional lineages. So something like Longman Dragon Gate inside of modern Chenjen, complete perfection, is those have charisms, meaning spiritual qualities or commitments that define them, right? So if you're, like we are, part of the Huashan, the Mount Hua lineage, that has a different charism than Longmen or Dragon Gate. So you go through a process of discernment in determining what your affinities and aspirations are, and that's what locates you inside of lineage. I mean, there are many other dimensions of lineage, but it's to kind of say, like, we have to be thinking about the politics of some of these moves in global Taoism that are constructing things in a particular way. So from my perspective, really the way to begin thinking about Taoist identity and locatedness is through this kind of concentric circle model. So the Tao is obviously the largest, the outermost circle, and the innermost circle is the self, the individual. So one can be a Taoist simply by being connected to the Tao, right? Obviously in a deeper way than we were talking about earlier. But usually to say one is a Taoist or to think about Taoist identity and locatedness is to locate oneself in Taoism, right? To say Taoist is to invoke Taoism, to invoke the religious tradition, which is Taoism. So that could be it. One could simply be kind of inside of Taoism, participating in it, involved in a particular way that is Taoist, but isn't inside of a movement or inside of a lineage. But then many Taoists are part of a given movement. So just using myself as an example, we're part of the Chenjen, the complete perfection movement. So inside of Taoism, that's the movement that we're part of. And inside of Chenjen, we're part of the Huashan, the Mount Hua lineage. So there's that kind of relationship of being inside of lineage, being inside of movement, being inside of Taoism, being inside of the Tao, at least ideally speaking. But you don't need those two innermost circles of movement and lineage, as I was referring to earlier. And part of the reason I'm saying all of this is I have these different elements of identity where I could privilege them and I could kind of elevate a certain construction of Taoism that would point towards me or point towards the Daoist Foundation or something like that. But this is not true, right? You do not have to be part of a movement. You do not have to be part of a lineage to be a Taoist. You do not need to know Chinese, right? So as I was saying earlier, yes, right, a lot of my work is focuses on Chinese-based research and scholarship and translation. So it'd be easy for me to say, oh, you need to be fluent in classical Chinese to be a real Taoist, and I'm not saying that. So part of the reason I'm not saying that is it's not true in terms of the contours of Taoist history, or I think the defining characteristics of Taoism as a tradition. So this involves some kind of deeper exploration. But what I'm really trying to point towards here is you going through a process, right, of how you're located. So some people do feel an affinity with a particular movement or a particular lineage, and that might lead to initiation or ordination. But this brings up all kinds of questions about what are the defining characteristics of those movements or those lineages? How is one located in it? How does one express it? What is one cultivating? How is that different from just being a Taoist more broadly? And then, and this is what's oftentimes left out in the modern world, is what are the particular responsibilities of being located that way? So this is specifically related to ordination. Ordination is not about wearing a particular set of clothes or having a certificate. From my perspective, it's really about an ontological shift. That is, one's being has been transformed and one has a certain set of responsibilities in relationship to the tradition. But that's a topic for another day. So when we think about Taoist location, social location, and participation, there are many ways that Taoists have been located in the Taoist tradition. There are many ways or paths that Taoists have followed. They're alchemists, they're ascetics, they're hermits, they're householders, they're martial artists, they're monastics, there's priests, they're ritualists, they're teachers, and so on. So there are different forms of participation. There are different forms of involvement, right? Some are more on the periphery, some are more in the center, some are more institutional, some are less institutional. And as I was saying, because in the modern world, Taoism is being constructed in a particular way, certain things are being privileged, which may or may not be relevant to the average person. So is that, and by average person, I just mean like somebody that's interested in Taoism. It's not disparaging, just saying not someone who wants to be a Taoist priest or not someone who wants to practice Taoist ritual. So as a Taoist, do you have to be ordained? Do you have to be a priest or monastic? No. Okay, but if you are, then how are you located in the tradition that might be different? Do you have to practice ritual? No. But if you do, what are the dominant forms of Taoist ritual? How does one get trained that way? How does one do the ritual and so forth? So just showing you the broad spectrum of this, of how one could be located in the Taoist tradition, the kind of path that one could follow. And this relates to what I've talked about before about models of Taoist practice and attainment. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I've talked about them on a lot of different occasions. They're in a lot of my writings. But thinking about, there are many different models or paths in Taoism. So we can just look at a couple. Alchemical, the transformation of self through the ingestion of various substances. That would be external. So in Chinese, Waidan, external alchemy, or the outer elixir, and or through complex physiological practices. Internal, so Neidan, the inner elixir. So thinking about our internal alchemy. So is one following an alchemical path, right, with this aspiration for immortality? If so, what kinds of, we'll focus more on internal alchemy, what kinds of practices is one doing? This might stand in contrast to something like the quietistic path, focusing on non-action or effortlessness, involving non-interference, non-intervention, effortless activity as central. So these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but oftentimes they have different emphases, different values, different types of practices that they're doing. Sometimes they're combined. But one of the reasons to show you this is to have us think through our own affinities or our own commitments, our own aspirations. So are you interested in dietetics? If so, there are many different Taoist approaches to how we eat or what we consume and so on. Are you interested in scripture study and interpretation? Okay, well then there are Taoist traditions of reading and interpretation, including commentaries and so on. So we can use this again as another map to identify how people are located in the tradition, why they're emphasizing what they're emphasizing, but also for ourselves, like what kinds of things interest us. So from a more normative perspective, I would say there are these primary considerations that we should investigate. Our own affinities, our own sense of alignment. To what extent are we aligned with the Tao? Are we aligned with the tradition? Our own aspirations? Are we connected? What is our orientation? As I mentioned, from my perspective, the primary orientation of Taoist is the Tao. So are we focusing on that? Are we thinking about our lives beyond the limitations of a kind of imagined separate existence, but that there's something larger than ourselves, this possibility of sacred orientation and sacred connection? So of course, from a Taoist perspective, this is numinous, this is mysterious. There's the sacred connection that's energetic in nature. So we can talk about the three orientations. This is one of the primary frameworks that we use, the Sanfang: view, practice, and experience. And these go together. So are we using a Taoist view? Are we doing Taoist practices? Are we having distinctively Taoist experiences? Are those Taoist experiences confirming the Taoist view and the Taoist practice? And of course, that's diverse, right? That's complex. There are different Taoist views, different Taoist practices, different Taoist experiences. But one of the reasons to show you this is because in the modern world, there are a lot of people, one, reducing practice to technique. So that's not the case. Practice is larger than technique, but also extracting Taoist techniques out of the larger Taoist tradition and a larger Taoist approach, including a Taoist view. So these go together. It's possible to practice Taoist methods without a Taoist view, and that's largely what's going on in the modern world. So the other thing that means is that you're going to have different kinds of experiences that aren't necessarily Taoist experiences. Experiences that confirm the efficacy of Taoist practice or the specific views that are informing those practices and so on. We also talk about the three expressions, the San Xian: cultivation, embodiment, and transmission. So from my perspective, we can talk about this as Xiu Dao, Qi Dao, Chuan Dao: cultivating the Tao, embodying the Tao, transmitting the Tao. Everyone who's a Taoist is cultivating the Tao in some respect. We're all doing a certain kind of practice oriented toward the Tao. Ideally, then, the deeper we go into that cultivation, the more fully that becomes embodied in our being, in our lives. So that's Ti Dao, that's embodying the Tao, becoming a manifestation of the Tao in the world. But this can be largely unknown, all right? Going back to that earlier quotation that I used, because they could not be recognized, we feel compelled to describe their qualities. Okay, the Tao is becoming embodied in certain beings, but maybe only Taoists are recognizing that Taoist embodiment. Obviously, that's not the case. Other people recognize it, but it has a very particular kind of energetic quality and maybe even expression through movement. But that could be completely internal, right? There would be an external expression, but maybe no one's recognizing it. And from my perspective, all Taoists are cultivating the Tao and working to embody the Tao. Transmitting the Tao is a different kind of undertaking. That's largely the responsibility of Taoist priests, Taoist monastics, Taoist elders, Taoist teachers. So not just cultivating and embodying the Tao, but helping other people to cultivate and embody the Tao, and also helping to transmit the tradition, especially in a modern context. And that's what we're talking about here, global Taoism. So who's helping to orient people towards the Tao and reminding them, right, that this is how we cultivate and embody the Tao, and these are part of the transmissions of being a Taoist. So in the Taoist tradition, sometimes a distinction is made between Daoren, so we're reading top to bottom, left to right. Normally it would be top to bottom, right to left, but I'm just making this easier. So looking at the left two characters, Daoren, you can see the top character is the same. So Daoren and the right characters are Dao Shi. So Daoren literally means person of the Tao. This is the most general kind of way that Taoists talk about Taoists. Everyone is a Daoren, right, that's involved in participating in the tradition. So everyone is a person of the Tao or in the Tao. Then there are Dao Shi, so literally adepts of the Tao or practitioners of the Tao. This is a technical term that's used to designate ordained Taoist priests and monastics, recognizing that both men and women can be monastics and priests in the Taoist tradition. So one of the reasons to give you this is not to privilege Dao Shi, Taoist priests or Taoist monastics over Daoren, ordinary Taoists, quote unquote. It's to say that there are different ways of being located in the tradition, different ways of being a Taoist or Taoist being. One can simply be participating in the tradition or aligned with the Tao. That's Daoren. However, one might also have a vocation, a kind of sacred calling to be ordained, right? To go into being part of the Taoist clergy or the monastic tradition. And that's the Dao Shi. So as I mentioned earlier, from my perspective, a Taoist priest or an adept of the Tao in this technical sense is not a functional role in the community. It can be. It's not about what you do. It's ontological. It's about what one is. It's about a certain set of commitments and responsibilities, thinking about clerical identity and community. So from my perspective, besides what I was talking about previously about cultivating, embodying, and transmitting the Tao, it's also the way in which one's located in the community and the responsibility to the community to help guide the community, to help individuals cultivate the Tao. So we can think about this as spiritual direction. And that there's this kind of emphasis on modeling something, but also helping guide the community and filling a certain kind of role in the community for the welfare of all the individuals in the community. So that's more the role of a Dao Shi. However, we can also think about this in terms of Daoren, people of the Tao, ordinary Taoists, quote unquote. That is, a Taoist teacher could be a Daoren and not a Dao Shi. A community elder could be a Daoren and not a Dao Shi. So these aren't necessarily equivalent. That is, being a community leader or community elder doesn't necessarily require ordination or lineage or so on. And so one of the things we want to be thinking about here is how we're located socially inside of the Taoist tradition, and that it's not necessarily hierarchical or privileging one over the other. It's more about, as I said, affinities and aspirations. So there's this conversion question. A lot of people contact me with this kind of anxiety of, am I really a Taoist? Or as I mentioned before, about do I belong here? Or, oh, but this group of people is telling me I'm not a Taoist because I'm not Chinese. Or this group of people is telling me I'm not a Taoist because I don't have ordination or lineage. So it's a source of anxiety and instability for a lot of people. One way of thinking about this is in terms of death, right? So how does one kind of understand life and death? Do we think about ourselves as one being with one lifetime? Are we being reincarnated? And so on. So when we think about the conversion question from a Taoist perspective, it's not merely sociological. So that's a way of saying, like, if you look at things from a sociological perspective, Louis Komjathy, right, was born from these 7 primarily Western European and Eastern European ethnicities in Detroit, Michigan, right, to this particular family, raised Roman Catholic in terms of the Italian side of the family, but with an atheistic side of the family that was kind of telling me, right, don't be religious and so on. And then at some point, I converted to Taoism. And so from a sociological perspective, I was a birthright Catholic, at least on paper, and then I converted to Taoism. But that's not necessarily the case from a Taoist perspective, because you aren't necessarily what you were born into. There may be many other influences. So thinking about conversion from a Taoist perspective, especially as influenced by Buddhism, you have the question of reincarnation. You have the question of what Taoists talk about as yuan fun, right? So I usually translate this as predestined affinities. So some kind of endowment, right, from the cosmos that gives you a certain kind of affinity with Taoism or with another tradition. It doesn't have to be solely Taoist, right? There are people converting from different traditions to other traditions all of the time. So there are multiple source points. We can even think of this as trans-temporal. One of the interesting things in the modern world, right, is that because Taoism, the globalization of Taoism is so recent, it's kind of being framed in more conservative ways. Well, there's mainland Chinese Taoism, there's Chinese Taoism, and is one connected to Chinese Taoism, right? But people don't ask that question of Vietnamese Buddhists. They don't ask, like, do you have any connection to like pre-modern Indian Buddhism? Or, you know, to what extent are you Indian or Christianity or Islam or so on? So there's a kind of ease of conversion to different traditions that might be kind of obstructed or obscured in Taoism. So to what extent is conversion acceptable in Taoism? And I would say, first of all, you don't have to convert to Taoism, right? You can be a Taoist without conversion, quote unquote. There are ways to formally convert to Taoism, but there's also this question of how Taoists kind of view conversion. And it's more of like a personal matter. It's like, if that's your affinity, then you're a Taoist. Or maybe you have an affinity with Taoism before, right, you've converted to Taoism. And this is the way a lot of people find their way to Taoism. One challenge here, of course, is how to think about the relationship, as I said before, of culture, ethnicity, and religion. And what's the parallel example to Taoism? Is Taoism more like an indigenous religion or an indigenous kind of cultural tradition where you're born into it and it's so place specific and culture specific that it's very difficult to convert? Or is it more like these other traditions like Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, where it's global and it's kind of been decoupled from its like source ethnicity and source culture? I think it's more of the latter, but we're in that transition. So it hasn't fully happened yet. So it's strange, right? It's strange to see a Euro-American ordained Taoist priest speaking normatively about the Taoist tradition, whereas in other traditions, this would just be like kind of normal or acceptable. So we can also think about the 3 refuges, and this is what I was talking about how we're located in the Taoist tradition. I'm not going to go through all these, but in general, the way, so this is the San Qing, the 3 purities. And when you look at this, you usually look at it from the point of view of the altar, but we can talk about it from our perspective. So the middle is the highest, position 1, that's Yuan Shi Tianzuan, the celestial worthy of original beginning. And then on his quote unquote left, our right, is Lingbao Tianzuan, the celestial worthy of numinous treasure. So technically this is guest 1, so position 2, and then Dao De Tianzuan, the celestial worthy of the Tao and inner power, guest 2 or position 3. And in the Taoist tradition, these are oftentimes referred to as the 3 refuges, obviously being influenced by Buddhism. And then there are all these other ternary or 3 associations. So the 3 heavens is the next line, then the external 3 treasures, the Tao, the scriptures, and the teachers, the internal 3 treasures, in this case, spirit as the highest, quote unquote, chi and vital essence, and then the 3 fields or the 3 elixir fields, the upper, the middle, and the lower. One of the reasons to show this to you is that if you're talking about conversion, there are more formal kinds of conversion rituals or actions that are taken. And one of the things that one does is take the 3 refuges, or taking refuge in the 3 external treasures of the Tao, the scriptures, and the teachers in that order. And there are different ways of doing this. So I don't want to focus on that so much, but I want to talk about kind of why this is important. So it's not necessary, but it is a kind of more formal Taoist commitment. It may be an internal vow or an external ritual. And in this case, what one does, as you see also in Buddhism, which might be more familiar to some of you, is you take refuge in the Tao. You take refuge in the scriptures. You take refuge in the teachers. And these 3 external treasures, or these external 3 treasures, are the 3 refuges. But they're also invoking these other dimensions of the tradition, and they're locating us in the tradition. So here we see it's not just the Tao, it's the Tao manifesting through the second of the external 3 treasures, the scriptures. So are we rooted in the scriptures? Do we have knowledge of the sacred texts of Taoism? Are our views kind of informed by that, and kind of, and also you could say confirmed by them? But also the teachers. So are the teachers cultivating the Tao, embodying the Tao? Are they informed by the scriptures? And this is why I said in this order. You have a lot of teachers that sometimes aren't even emphasizing the Tao, but also have no root in the scriptures. So you don't have to necessarily do scripture study, but there's a question of what is the source of the teachings? Are the teachings connected to the Tao and connected to the scriptures? And then of course, if you're thinking about specific movements, a lot of times those movements emphasize specific scriptures. So in the case of Shenzhen, Complete Perfection Taoism, emphasizing the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, the Yin Fu Jing, the scripture on the hidden talisman, and the Qing Jing Jing, the scripture on clarity and stillness. So if one is a Shenzhen Taoist, is one familiar with those scriptures? Is one's teachings informed by those scriptures? And so on. So we can talk about foundational Taoist being. And foundational Taoist being, from my perspective, that is not focusing on being a Taoist, but having the Tao infuse and manifest through one's being. That we focus on an aspiration for and an orientation towards the Tao. There's a focus on practice realization. So thinking about practice leading to realization, and realization being an expression of practice. The Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power, and the Zhuangzi, the book of Master Zhuang, these 2 classical Taoist texts being the foundation. And what I mean by that is like setting a foundational view, giving us certain kinds of principles and commitments that enable us to kind of orient ourselves towards the Tao and also root ourselves in the tradition. An emphasis on virtue, so following the path of virtue. This can be quite challenging in the modern world, given the absence of virtue in so many situations and among so many people. But that virtue really is foundational in Taoism. You can also think about this in terms of the De of the Tao Te Ching, inner power or virtue, the way the Tao manifests through embodied human being in the world. The 5 precepts borrowed from Buddhism, right? The 9 practices, this is especially emphasized from our perspectives. This comes from the early Celestial Masters movement, but really interesting as 9 practices or principles derived from the Tao Te Ching. And there's another talk on that. Energetic presence, this is really important. So the Tao manifesting through Taoists as this numinous, mysterious presence that's recognizable. So this is why Taoism can be somewhat abstract or difficult to understand for people. Also why it's a source of confusion or argumentation among people that don't really have Taoist experiences, because the Tao is formless. So there is this way that Taoists merge into formlessness and non-differentiation, and that becomes an energetic presence that's recognizable. From my perspective, that is in fact what the Tao Te Ching, that line that I referenced at the beginning of the talk, because they could not be recognized, we feel compelled to describe their qualities. They're talking about the energetic presence. That when you do this kind of cultivation, that energetic presence becomes stronger in you, but also it becomes more recognizable to you, manifesting through other beings in the world, and not necessarily just human beings. And then embodiment and movement. So there is a very particular way of embodying the Tao in the world, being an embodiment of the Tao, but also the Taoist tradition, and then the way that Taoists move, which is unique. It's different than other traditions. And this is kind of one of my larger theories about religion, religious traditions, is that when people are fully rooted in a given tradition, it manifests through a particular recognizable movement pattern in the world. And so that's the case with Taoism. And so finally, then, we can say that Taoists emphasize Tao Qi, the Qi of the Tao or Wei energy. And you might have heard of Qi before. This is a different Qi character. This is the Taoist Qi character. It consists of the top part is Ji, that means collect or to gather, and the bottom part is Huo, fire. The Taoists also read the upper character as Wu, non-differentiation, and Yi, one. So the non-differentiated unity of the Tao manifesting as the subtle warmth, the subtle presence in the body and in the world. And so there are different types of qi, right? This can also be thought of as ling qi, numinous qi. There's a type of qi that's less differentiated, more non-differentiated or undifferentiated, more formless. And this is the sacred presence, the sacred transmission of Taoism. So inward training, Neye, chapter 26 says, it will permeate your skin and saturate your hair. And when you read classical Taoist texts and Taoist scriptures carefully, what you find is that there is this really strong emphasis on the subtle presence, on the subtle reality that we can cultivate, that we can embody, that we can even transmit to the world and to each other and participate in it. So we can think of this as an energetic field of participation. That's our own body, but that's also the tradition of the Tao as the Taoist body, and also the universe as the body of the Tao. Thanks for listening.